I have created a method to bring a pixel art river like this one to life. And in this video I will break it down into a few easy to follow steps. So even if you've never tried to animate one before, you will be able to create your own river animations, no matter if it's for a standalone pixel art scene like this one, or for your game project as an animated 2D background. Even if you are looking for animating river tiles for your game, you'll be able to apply the main idea of this method. So definitely check it out. So grab your mouse or drawing tablet, fire up Aseprite, and let's get started. Let's begin by creating a new scene. The exact resolution you want may depend on the project you have in mind, but if you just want to create a standalone scene like me, it doesn't really matter. So we can just pick a 16:9 resolution, for example 160 by 90 pixels. Or accidentally type in 80 instead of 90 like me and only realize at the very end when creating a thumbnail for the video. Also set it to index color mode and a transparent background. Now let's create the overall composition of our scene. And for that we need some colors. The river is the main point of our attention today, so we at least want colors for the river, the surrounding land and the sky. So let's pick some light blue and a green tone for the sky and the land respectively, and quickly draw those in on two separate layers. For the river, let's actually create three different blue tones. One base color and then one darker and one lighter variant of that blue tone. What I also like to do is create yet another layer, which I call grayscale, on top of all other layers. Fill it completely with black, then go to its layer properties and switch the layer mode from normal to color. This will result in a grayscale version of all layers below, which we can toggle on or off whenever we want to check our color values. Colors are not the focus of this tutorial though, but if you want more detailed information on how to pick good colors and create your own color palettes, you can check out the video linked in the description below. Now let's create a new layer called River Base and draw in the shape of the flowing river with the blue base color. In my case, I decided to let it flow from a vanishing point in the horizon towards the viewer with a couple of winding curves. I do this because this will prove as a good study of the various effects we need to consider when animating the river, such as different water speeds in straight river segments compared to curves, as well as perspective distortions. Feel free to create your own river shapes though, and if you want to keep things a bit simpler for now, you can decide to not have curved segments or not let the river vanish at the horizon in a single point, but rather let it flow out of the canvas to the left or right. Once we have a basic river shape, we want to rearrange our layers a bit so that we can more conveniently draw in our river base without painting over the surrounding land and without having to use selections for that all the time. So what we can do is right-click the river base layer and select Merge Down. Now both the land and the river are on the same layer, and then we can use the magic wand tool by pressing W on your keyboard to select only the green land parts again, and then cut-paste them onto a new layer above the current layer via Ctrl X and Ctrl V. Then we can rename the two layers again to land on top and river base below, and now we can paint freely in our river base layer without worrying about the green parts. If you do go for winding curves like I do here with my river shape, you can also create some sandbanks on the inner sides of each meander, as they call it. This is a natural phenomenon where sand, gravel or sediment is formed in those locations because of the water flowing slower there. On the opposite side, the water is usually much faster, so there you will naturally see some erosion, which means soil being carved out over time and transported along the river. We will simulate those different speeds of the water at varying points along the river, and it will make for some really nice looking flow behavior. But before we get to that, at least in my case, I decided to first add some more of the surrounding scenery. So I created some hills, mountains and clouds. Those scenery details are not necessary for the river animation itself, of course, so if you want to focus only on the actual animation, you can keep the scenery simple, or skip this step entirely if you like. But now let's start animating the river. We start by setting all layers as linked. You can either click here for each layer individually, or simply press the button on top to link all of them at once. Now we can press Alt-N a couple of times to give ourselves more frames for our animation. Let's start with 16 frames. The fact that we have linked the layers means that the content of all those layers will stay the same for the frames we just added, which is indicated by the straight line connection between the frame cells. Now let's add two more layers right above the river base layer. The first I call River Particles, and the second Vector Field. We will see in a bit what I mean by that. At this point, I also decided to quickly add 2 simple trees to the scenery on yet another layer, because I figured that we didn't have any size reference objects in the scene yet. So just to get a better understanding of the scale of the scene, you can add some trees like I did, or a building, or whatever fits your setting. You will later see that I ended up making those trees much bigger, but we will get to that too. So back to this vector field layer. What's the point of that? A vector field in mathematics can in simple words be described as a sea of arrows like this. Each arrow is a vector and it has a certain position somewhere in this space, as well as a length and a direction. The mathematical function that describes such a collection of arrows is called a vector field. But don't worry, you don't need a deeper mathematical understanding of this for creating a river animation. It's just a very helpful concept and illustration when we think about how to animate our river. Because imagine that this vector field describes the flow of a river, and we now put a floating piece of wood, for example, somewhere here. What that vector field then tells us is how this piece of wood moves across the water surface in each step. We can simply let it follow the distances and directions that are provided by the arrows. And the very same concept we will now use to animate our river. We will not use a floating piece of wood, but water particles or pixel clusters with a different blue tone than our river base layer, and let them flow from the faraway points in our image towards the viewer and to the bottom of the canvas. Of course, it works just as well in the other direction if you want, so if you want the river to flow away from the viewer, you can do that too. And this is why we added the river particles layer, because there the magic will happen. But to make those water particles move, we first need to draw our vector field. And this is why we added a separate layer for that too. Let's pick the lightest blue tone in our palette, select the vector field layer and start drawing in some vectors. If you had a very big canvas and or a high resolution, you could draw them as actual arrows, but since in our example space is more limited, we can just use individual pixels, which represent the tip of each arrow. The directional information is also implicitly given, because we decided of the flow direction of our river beforehand. If we were creating a lake, for example, we might want to use line segments to show the flow directions across the water surface. But a river is a bit of a special case here, so a set of lanes of individual pixels is good enough here. And this is what we are creating now. In order to place those pixels, we can follow a few simple rules. Rule number 1. On a straight river segment, water flows faster in the center than on the sides. Rule number 2. In a curved river segment, water flows fastest in the outer bend, slower in the center, and slowest in the inner bend. Rule number 3. The travel distance of a single pixel should be smaller the further away it is from the viewer because of the perspective. So if you're creating a top-down or isometric river for a tile-based game, for example, you can ignore the third rule because there will be no perspective distortion. But you can still follow the first and second rule here. This means that we put pixels in the same lane closer together when water speed is slow and further apart when water speed is higher in this area. In our case, we do have perspective distortion too, so we also make sure that our vector field captures that by letting pixels move slower the further away they are and faster the closer they get towards the bottom of the canvas. And once we have our vector field, we can start using it. We could either keep the blue base color of the river and add darker clusters as floating particles, but I felt that in my case the opposite might look better. So I changed the river base to the darkest blue in the palette and then picked the medium blue color to create the floating particles. But again, this is up to you and you can use those colors as you like. Oh, speaking of like, make sure to do that too. Thank you. So now we can go to frame 1 and to our river particles layer and we draw in a simple shape like this. Then select this shape and press Ctrl B to turn it into a custom brush. With this brush, we now fill the first frame of our river like this, until we are happy with the result. And now comes the big trick. From those water particles in the first frame that we just created, we can now more or less randomly select a portion by using the lasso tool, which you can activate by pressing Q on your keyboard. So just press Q and then take out a fragment of those water particles that we have just drawn and turn them into a custom brush again by pressing Ctrl and B. And this fragment we can now move along in our vector field in the other frames of our animation. Just use the left or right cursor keys to move from frame to frame and click with our custom brush on the dots in our vector field step by step to make that fragment move. Don't pay too much attention to detail or keeping things clean yet, because things will fall into place later anyway. But one thing is important here. Move the fragment in both directions, so do not only move it forward along the vector field from frames 2 to 16, but also backwards along the vector field from frame 16 back to 1. Or at least as far as needed until it disappears from our view either at the vanishing point on the horizon or outside of the canvas at the bottom. It is okay to have the same fragment multiple times in our animation, because in the end this will not be noticeable anymore. It does, however, help a lot with making the animation loop correctly. Because if we keep doing this for all other water particles too, we do not need to worry about abrupt jumps from the last frame back to the first, because everything will be a smooth transition. And this is already the general idea of the method. Now we just need to make sure to repeat this step over and over for many more of those clusters until all frames are sufficiently filled. Don't be afraid to put clusters on top of already existing clusters and create some noise in the overall animation. This will look good in the end. While you are proceeding with this method, make sure to always focus on the parts where there are still gaps and fill those gaps first, while ignoring the parts of the river that already have sufficient particles, even if that means that some shapes you will not fully move from start to finish. Just go back and forth in your animation timeline every now and then to see if the general flow of the river is still readable. In the end, you want this effect where you as a viewer can focus on an individual portion of the river and be able to trace it with your eye from start to finish, while still being mildly distracted by a certain level of randomness in the flowing shapes and forms. In my opinion, this combination of being able to trace individual parts while still having some randomness going on is what makes this very readable as a flowing river. And with our vector field as a guideline which captures the flow behavior of a river as it occurs in nature, the process becomes quite simple to follow and doesn't require much thinking, and the result is worth it, I think. Once we are happy with this step, we can add another layer on top of the particles layer called Splash, in which we will create those lighter blue foamy parts. Be careful not to overdo it with those foamy parts, because I think less is more in this case. Make sure that those parts start small and then grow in size moderately the closer they flow towards the viewer, but do not let them become too big either. Think of those foamy parts as clusters that form spontaneously, then get carried away by the water flow, while spreading out and dissolving during the process into smaller parts again. Also make them splash against the shore, where the water is moving fastest, like here on the left side in my case. And once we have that, the result looks like this when we play it with 150 milliseconds per frame. I think it is clearly readable as a flowing river, but the biggest problem at this point is that the water moves too fast compared to the scale of the scene, which again is mainly defined by the two temporary trees that I added. So as I mentioned earlier, I decided to improve this by making the trees much bigger, which in turn reduces the overall scale of the scene. I also improved the tip of the sandbank, which seemed a bit too pointy after all, as well as the area near the vanishing point, to make it more clear that the river is supposed to disappear behind the hills. So without actually tweaking the playback speed of the animation, the river already seems to flow a bit slower, because the virtual camera is now closer to it than before. And this is the updated version, again played back with 150 milliseconds per frame. I think this already looks quite nice, and we could call it a day at this point. However, I couldn't quite let it go yet, because I felt that 16 frames are not enough to really make it flow as smoothly as I intended it to. So I went the extra mile and I added another 16 frames in between the initial ones. The general idea for creating those in-between frames is still the same. Randomly select clusters from the previous or next frame using the lasso tool, make those a custom brush, and then move them according to the vector field, while making sure that the flow looks correct at all times. And once I had added those extra 16 frames, making it a total of 32 frames, I increased the playback speed to 100 milliseconds per frame, and the final animation looks like this. So now you can create your own nature scenes with flowing rivers through stunning pixel art landscapes. And if you want to add great looking trees and bushes to those landscapes, check out how to do that in this video next.